right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this discussion on an important topic, democratic erosion and how to prevent it. I'm Noam Lupu. I'm on the faculty here at Vanderbilt in political science and also associate director of the LAPOP lab. And I'm joined with some excellent panelists who know a lot about democratic erosion, hopefully also a little bit about how to prevent it. Susan Stokes is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor in Political Science at the University of Chicago, where she's also the director of the Chicago Center on Democracy. Sue's a leading scholar of democratic theory and practice with a focus on how democracy functions in developing societies, the role of distributive politics in democracy, and public opinion and behavior. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the author of numerous influential books and articles, and co-director of Brightline Watch, which hopefully we'll hear about a little bit today. Josh Clinton is my colleague, is the Abby and John Winkelried Chair and Professor of Political Science here at Vanderbilt, where he's also co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Josh studies American politics, including research on democratic institutions, campaigns, elections, public opinion. He also co-directs the Vanderbilt poll, and he recently chaired the report of the American Association for Public Opinion Research on the pre-election polling in the 2020 election. And maybe we'll hear a little bit about that as well. So to start things off, Sue, I was hoping you might be able to tell us a little bit about this topic that we're here to think about. So how do we think about the concept of democratic erosion or democratic backsliding?
Well, thank you all for coming. This is really fun to be here at Vanderbilt, and really grateful to the organizers and to Noam and Josh. So what is democratic erosion? So when democracies died until, let's say, maybe 20 years ago, they usually died in military coups or coups. And so it was pretty clear that they were dying because some general would come on TV and say, I'm in charge now, and the Constitution is, forget about it. Well, you can use that as, tissues or something, and we're going to close down the Congress. And if newspapers are going to be appearing, they're going to have big blank spaces on the front page where censored material is not there. So there was no question. There was, sometimes they were violent, and it was pretty clear what was happening, and it was all at once. In recent decades, and particularly in this century so far, what we're seeing is the I'm not going to say the death of democracy. Sometimes it's issued in the death of democracy, but the decline of democracy in a much more gradual and you might think of as insidious way, in the sense that it's so gradual and sometimes so nuanced that we're not sure it's happening while it's happening. And that's a big problem, because we can have our democracies slip away from us without realizing they're slipping away until it's too late. So what does that look like? Well, the actors are also different. So rather than the military typically coming in with their tanks, you have elected officials, presidents, prime ministers, chief executives of the country, getting elected through free and fair elections, and then turning around and undermining the institutions that on which democracy resides. So they come to office, they tell us that the press is not trustworthy, the press is the enemy of the people, they undermine whatever independence the courts may have, they change the way high courts are nominated, they change the terms for high judges, they change the jurisdiction and the kind of rules that govern the behavior of judges and prosecutors. They may attack make the civil administration, the kind of the bureaucracy, more partisan at higher levels, at lower levels, I should say. They may, sort of change the rules for civil servant appointments and for firing people from the civil service. They may go around talking about the deep state and the idea that bureaucrats are kind of political hacks or partisan actors. They undermine our faith in elections by saying that election administration bodies are partisan or cheaters or corrupt, and you can't trust the outcome of elections and unless I win, and then you can trust them. So these things happen not necessarily all at once, but they tend to happen with enough regularity and predictability that people use the term playbook to describe them. And they happen in a lot of different regions of the world, a lot of different parts of the world. But I would say those are the key things to keep in mind.
So a lot of your work and expertise kind of does look comparatively across all these different countries. And so like building on that definition, so where are some regions or some countries or examples that kind of really demonstrate this democratic backsliding that you're talking about?
So I had a nice map for you guys, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to show it, but it's distributed across a lot of different regions in the world. So if I showed you this map and you saw that the red countries are countries that at some point in the last 20 years or so had undergone democratic erosion, they would include several countries in Latin America, they would include the United States, several countries in Central and Eastern Europe, several countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, some in East Asia. So very geographically diverse and dispersed. And sort of classic cases that people in our field have looked at closely would include places like Turkey under Erdogan, under the AKP, where you start with a country that is recently redemocratized, elects and is a country that is renowned for its secularism in the Middle East, North Africa kind of sphere, a majority Muslim country that's a sort of secular democracy, and a more religious party is elected, and the leader of that party starts working on this playbook. The independence of the courts is undermined, confidence in elections, and so forth. The press very much undermined. It's very difficult to say that there's any kind of free press in Turkey today. Hungary is another country that has experienced similar kind of erosion under the second government, a second and now third government of, or I guess fourth we're up to, but of Viktor Orban, who was in office. So this is an interesting thing. He was in office earlier and had a pretty conventional, he's a conservative politician, somewhat nationalistic, but a pretty conventional time in office, lost an election, stepped down, no big deal, came back, and that's when they changed the constitution and sort of gerrymandered the whole country, made it harder for the opposition to turn their votes into seats in the parliament, undermined freedom of the press, undermined the universities in a very aggressive way. So those are classic cases. Russia is a country we're all paying a lot of attention to right now. Russia doesn't make it onto our map as an eroding country because it never got to the point of really being enough of a consolidated democracy to erode. And then I should mention that there's, the Latin American countries have eroded under, when they have eroded under left-wing governments for the most part, an exception being Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and El Salvador now is another exception to that. But major cases, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, where leftist leaders, sort of took on the same playbook. So it's not so clear that this is necessarily a right-wing project or a left-wing project.
So part of what you've been trying to do is sort of, increase public awareness of this kind of issue, and sort of going back to the issue of sometimes it's a little hard to see while it's happening, sort of getting the public more informed about how to be able to see when it's happening. So can you tell us a little bit about Brightline Watch?
Sure, yeah. So Brightline Watch is a small organization of academics. There's one of us, me at the University of Chicago, and two colleagues from Dartmouth, and one colleague from University of Rochester. And we, soon after the 2016 election, when there was a lot of concern about, where is American democracy going, we got together and decided that we were going to try to gather information from experts, basically from political scientists, about, what do we care about? What is democracy? What does it mean? What are the most important dimensions of it? Because you can list lots of things that we think of as sort of going with democracy. But what are the most important ones? What are less important ones? How concerned should we be, for example, when a president, describe, or one party describes the other party as traitorous, as opposed to just having wrong-headed policies. Is that something that we should really worry about? Should we worry about it to the same extent that we would worry about judicial independence being undermined, or legislative oversight functions being challenged? So we started, surveying experts. It was kind of an interesting project because there is no list of political scientists. There is actually not a list of people who have PhDs in political science operating in American universities. And if there is one that maybe the American Political Science Association has, we couldn't afford to buy it. So we constructed a list by, kind of the hard way, and we had lots of great undergraduate helpers who figured out, went sort of website by website and gathered email addresses. And we didn't sample, we just sent invitations to everybody on the list to asking them basically to answer two sets of questions. One, here's a long list of features of you might think of as going with democracy, which are essential, which are important but not essential, which are nice to have and which don't really matter, and got people to sort of rank them in that way. And then the second question is, how's the U.S. doing on these same dimensions? So we started doing that on a kind of almost quarterly basis, but then we decided it would be interesting to see how our experts' opinions compared with those of sort of normal citizens. And so we started doing public surveys with similar kinds of questions. One of the things that we found is that in general, the general citizenry is more concerned about the state of American democracy than our experts are. And we're not sure why that's true. We think it may be that many of our experts have knowledge and experience about different time periods of American politics, have knowledge of other countries, and therefore have kind of benchmarks that are slightly reassuring about what's happening in the United States. But that was a finding that was fairly stable over time. As time went on, we did kind of different kinds of questions. We added to that standard stock of questions. We were interested, for example, in the outcome of the 2020 election and how influential the so-called big lie has been. And like many other polling organizations, we basically found that about 2/3 of people who were supportive of the former president believed that the current president was not rightfully elected, which is a very large number. We asked one, I think our most controversial question was about what people thought about the United States splitting into different countries. We got a little flack for just asking that question. And I think, a lot of people thought it was a really bad idea. And we also gave kind of different versions of what that map might look like, and that's a complicated map to think about. So, but I think we had a good 20% or so of people who were pretty much ready to say goodbye to certain sets of states in our country. So we branched out a bit from there.
So digging into that a little bit, I mean, this notion of kind of political polarization and partisanship is like really endemic, it seems like, in our contemporary society. And like at Vanderbilt, we have the Unity Project that tries to promote that kind of dialogue and try to think about solutions. And so like, what do we do when we see like results? So we did a similar poll here in Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt poll, asking people like, simple question, do you agree or disagree that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidency? And like, just like you found in Brightline Watch, just like everyone finds, like 68% of Republicans, only 30% of Republicans agree, and only 68% of independents agree with that statement. And so that there's widespread disagreements about even like what happened even after the election certified and audited. And so how do we deal with that as a society? Like, how do we transition and kind of try to build solutions and try to get people more accepting about democratic legitimacy and what's going on in our country, given what you're finding in Brightline Watch and all the work that you're doing? Like, how do we start using this information to pivot to try to help build solutions and kind of rebuild or prevent further erosion from occurring?
Yeah, no, that's the key question, and that's, I don't think there's a single answer to it, and fortunately there are a lot of people working on that set of questions. What's the menu of things that we can do to stop a process that's still ongoing? I mean, my own feeling is that what happened after the 2020 election was a coup attempt, what we call in comparative politics a palace coup, meaning the sitting president tries to take over the system in violation of the Constitution. And that's not over because of the success of exactly what you say. So many people in our country believe that the election wasn't valid and that the person who won is not sitting in the White House. I think that in some ways it's not that surprising, given everything we know about how polarized this country is. It's not surprising that you can give people a simple set of facts about something that they're not going to know much about in their own lives, and tell them these facts are true and then spin that out for them. So, in social sciences, we have this concept of Bayesian updating, where you have some information about something that you start with, or beliefs about something you start with, and we call those priors, and then you get new information, and you don't throw out your old information. You basically kind of weight the new information with your prior beliefs, and you come up with a posterior set of beliefs that are going to be a little bit different. So in this case, you can think of people as having weak or non-existent priors about how elections work. Like, how many people really understand, who are not involved in election administration, what in a very concrete way, how it works, how you register people, what you do with ballots, how you count them, how you certify them, how that information is communicated. We learned a lot, but in the recent contest, but we don't really know how that works. So if you have a leader who you admire and believe in, and that leader gives you a piece of information about how it has worked, it's not like displacing a well-established set of beliefs that you already had in place. It's kind of filling in a blank. And so you fill in that blank with, oh, it's possible for people just to go in and mess this up in a pretty easy way without getting caught. And the people who administer elections are really, not only they come from political parties, because often they do, but they really care mostly about their party winning, and they're willing to cheat in order for, so if that's information you give them and it's not being weighted against any other kind of prior, then I don't think it's that surprising that they end up with, posterior beliefs that are pretty out there. So one of the things that I think matters, and there's a little bit of evidence about this, is just giving people better information. And even if you're giving it to them after they've already formed a new posterior that's pretty crazy, it might be the new set of new information that could push them a little bit in the other direction. So I think we were talking earlier about a small thing that Brightline Watch did, where we gave information to Republican voters in Arizona about how the audit of the elections, the legitimate audit of the elections after 2020 worked in a very detailed way. So here's what they do, here's what it looks like, and we found that we moved them in the direction of having more confidence that the elections actually were legitimate and not not tampered with. They had integrity. That's not an easy solution to impose or to scale up, but it is kind of some basic, and there's much more basic science on this, basic information or evidence that you can move people even when they have strong reasons to want to believe something different. And I think we talked about this as well. I have felt since the sort of crisis of misinformation and disinformation has exploded in our country, that all of us who work in the information economy, so to speak, should be explaining to people who don't do what we do how it is we do it. So if you're an academic, I get challenged by, my cousin who says, oh, he looks at Brightline Watch stuff and he says, you guys, of course you believe this. You guys are all a bunch of liberals. What do you know? And so I say, well, okay, we actually have very strict and rigorous rules about how we produce information. Like when we write articles or when we do research projects, we have to get the procedures vetted. There's a community thing. We have advisors. We have people who are working with us. If we try to publish something, we go through hell to get things published. We have referees who are very scary people, and so it's not, we can't just go make things up. And it's journalists, it's the same thing. In any good media organization, putting out information, publishing information is a very rigorous procedure. So you have editors and you have fact checkers and you need to get multiple sources and you are trying very hard to get non-anonymous sources and so on and so forth. So if you explain that to people in very clear and very concrete terms, I'm an irritatingly optimistic person, but I do think that can make a difference. That's just one sort of thought.
So one thing that's interesting is also, if people have kind of weak priors about how elections are run, it seems like they also have priors that lead them to be persuaded that the other side might cheat in a way that maybe in the past they weren't sort of quite so willing to believe that the other side is going to cheat. So I wonder about, sort of partisan polarization, like how much of this is driven by partisan polarization, or how much of it is sort of actually kind of feeding partisan polarization, actually, sort of the other way around?
All of the above, I think. Yeah, I think so. Why do we have polarized politics? Well, if you so there's a story I can tell you. In fact, Josh can tell you the story with much greater lucidity about how we ended up here in the United States. But I'm going to tell you that we're in the same place in a lot of countries around the world that have very different kinds of histories. So what is it that's more general that makes negative and polarizing political discourse so powerful? Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I've been reading political psychology, and I'll tell you that there are emotions that psychologists call approach emotions. And one of the most, what is an approach emotion? It's an emotion that you have that's going to make you want to go out, do things, be in people's faces, vote, protest, kind of get involved in stuff. And it's a kind of high energy, active state. And anger and moral outrage are powerful approach emotions. And if you're a politician and you want to get people to turn out to the polls and vote for you, getting them angry is a good shortcut to doing that. So you say things like, the press is the enemy of the people, or, my opponents are corrupt, and they sell themselves to Wall Street, and furthermore, if you can take a bad state of the world and make people believe, first of all, that it's not caused by extra human forces, but rather is the result of human action. And furthermore, the human action is really directed against you and people like you. That really gets them mad. And so that's a kind of quick, easy way to get people revved up and ready to go vote. Now, if it's so easy to do that, is that what politicians do all the time? Well, no, they don't. And in fact, some of you guys at least are old enough to remember when Barack Obama ran for president. That was a very different kind of discourse. That was a discourse that tended to elicit optimism and enthusiasm. And none of you are going to be old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan ran for president, but it was the same kind of optimism and enthusiasm, Morning in America. Now, a psychologist would say, well, that's easy. That's because another approach emotion is enthusiasm. So you have these competing possibilities of ways of getting people to turn out and go to the polls. Now, one of the things that we're interested in, some of the research we're doing at the University of Chicago Center on Democracy, is we think that we're interested in seeing which of these is more powerful and under what circumstances. And one of the things that's pretty self-evident is people who are sort of not polarized can be turned off by a polarizing discourse. So if you're operating in a setting in which you have kind of a big middle and not people so far apart from each other on the ends, then that enthusiasm kind of strategy, rhetorical strategy, is probably going to be a better route to go. If you're operating in a place like, unfortunately, America is today, where people are really far apart, not necessarily on policy, a bit on policy, but really far apart in terms of kind of tribal identities and what they think of one another and maybe general ideology, then feeding that by revving up your base, by saying, the other side are demons and we're the good guys, that's more effective. So I think it kind of loops back to the question of, what do you do about this? Because once you get in a cycle of polarization, you can see how that leads to more and more polarization. And in fact, again, if I could show you guys pictures, I would show you wait, I would show you a table with a regression analysis. So maybe you're happy that I'm not taking pictures. And the regression analysis comes out of work by one of our graduate students named Ipek Chinar, where she's looking at the impact of polarizing discourse on re-election possibilities, or negative discourse, let's say, on re-election possibilities. And she looks at all incumbents, presidents, prime ministers, and their attempts to get reelected. And she shows that if you use a negative kind of style of campaigning in a non-polarized setting, it makes your chances of being reelected less. If you use that kind of negative discourse in a highly polarized setting, it significantly increases your chances of getting reelected. So, so you can get caught in this kind of cycle of negativity leading to more polarization, encouraging more negativity. And how do you break that? Well, one of the things is just to remember that, it's possible to win with like maybe a political entrepreneur will come along and say, okay, these people are all yelling at each other. We know that a lot of people don't like that. I'm going to go out there and be entrepreneurial and start talking happy talk, and maybe that'll break the cycle, or put a break on the cycle.
Yes, I mean the role of information is obviously really critical to the story. Thinking about how people get their information, how they learn about the electoral process. But we also kind of live in a very polarized society in terms of how we consume our news. One thing that was particularly striking about some of the work you've done in the Brightline Watch is that you asked Democrats and Republicans what they think about other media outlets. And it was astonishing. I mean, I guess it was reassuring that they agreed, but disagreed, but not reassuring what they agreed upon. It's like 40% of Democrats thought that they should ban or restrict Fox News.
Right. And
40% of Republicans thought you should ban or restrict MSNBC.
Right.
Right. And so we all live in this kind of media bubbles. And so how do we create those opportunities? Like, is that going to be elite driven? Does that have to be bottom up pressures? So where people can get that information that they need to figure out what's going on in the world, because as you know, there does seem to be incentives, especially among the media, right, to kind of create this audience and who keeps tuning in and everything's going to be the death of America, either on the left or the right, to kind of up this crisis mode. But how do you break through that cycle to kind of get people the information they need to understand, what's the status of democracy, things are okay, or kind of what needs more attention to work?
Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer to that question. I'll give it a couple shots, but those are tough. So. Ezra Klein, who is a journalist and very thoughtful person, wrote a book about polarization, and his answer to that question is kind of a meditator's answer. It's sort of slightly obnoxious in that sense, but he's from Santa Cruz or whatever. But it's sort of stop when you. So we have multiple identities, and we are. I'm a student. I go to Vanderbilt, I'm from the Midwest, I'm a baseball fan, you have multiple, I'm a woman, you have multiple identities, and politicians are gonna wanna kind of get you to hate another identity and focus on a very boiled down version of what your identity is. I'm white, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, sort of very, kind of reduced form of what your identity kind of menu is. And what Klein says is, resist that, because remember, you have lots of different identities. So I'm kind of a baseball fan, and I find it fascinating that you can go to, I was in a Dodgers game last summer in California, and they were playing the Mets, and we were sitting behind some Mets fans. And we were it turned into a great big joke, and they were our buddies by the end of the game. It wasn't and we we were passionate fans, we wanted our teams to win, but it was a very bantery, fun interaction. So some kinds of identities don't make us want to kill each other. Now, if you ask soccer fans in Europe, then it's a different story. So I think that's one answer. I think that it's also important that maybe and this is a little bit maybe along the lines that Klein is trying to get us to think, being mindful of what they're trying to do when they try to do it. So, let's say you have a politician, a governor from a southern state who is saying, This beloved company is terrible because they're criticizing my policies, and I'm going to get you all mad about whatever. Sometimes I think ignore the whatever and just focus on the fact that he's trying to make us mad, and don't bite. Like, obviously you're going to argue back about things you care about, like, say, gay rights or, but in some ways, that's not really the point. The point is they're trying to polarize us, and it should be debunking to be able to say, this guy, what he's trying to do, he doesn't probably care that much about the issue. He cares a lot more about his own career, and he's trying to make us mad. And I'm going to be aware of that. Now, again, these are very individualized, et cetera. How you scale that up and how you make it an organized thing. I know there are lots of projects out there to get people to sort of talk over party lines and to talk across issue differences, and I think those are good. Something that's maybe more in the real world and maybe could be possibly more effective is we have these crises. COVID didn't do it because it became a polarized crisis very quickly, but we have a war in Europe. We have the first major war in Europe since the Second World War, and the potential for a nuclear holocaust and awful things being done to a country that we're learning about from the press, and suddenly the dimensions are getting a little shifted around, and we're not so polarized on that. There's a little bit of that around the edges, but mostly, like, it's so important and so frightening and so just so disturbing that I felt like, at least for a little bit of time, all the other stuff that we were fighting about just didn't seem important. Sort of like, let's say you're mad at your partner or your husband or your boyfriend or whatever, and then they get really sick and you think, why was I so worried about stupid stuff? I love this person and they're sick. It's kind of like a change of priorities that can come from the world changing. Maybe that's looking for a silver lining in a horrible situation in Europe, but could be that there are sort of changes in the way that we think about what we're up against that will shift that will create more room for not unanimity, but for at least seeing the world in the same way.
I wonder, we haven't really talked about public opinion much. Like, this is mostly backsliding coming from politicians doing this and that, or sort of manipulating people. And of course, we know from LAPOP surveys in Latin America, we know from surveys throughout Europe and the US that support for democracy is sort of declining. People's sort of commitment to democratic institutions is waning. People are obviously have sort of less trust in elections, but also think politicians are corrupt, have sort of less positive views about what democratic institutions can sort of deliver. So how much of that is driving what we're seeing? So how much are elites responding to, well, people aren't all that committed to these institutions, so, I can get rid of this and I can get rid of that. And
yeah. No, I think that's true. On the other hand, I also think that kind of erosion of support for democracy among the population is part of the strategy of backsliding. So I'm writing a book about democratic erosion, the working title of which is Trash Talking Democracy. So the idea is politicians want us to care less about protecting the democracy we have by telling us it's not so great anyway. Judges are really they're just partisans in robes, and the press is always getting things wrong, and there's no such thing as kind of selfless public service. Everybody's out for their own thing or their partisan hacks. And when people start to believe that, that's good for the politicians, for these kinds of politicians. Right. So I do think it's hard to separate them out, and I'm willing to think that when things go badly, like you have, the Great Recession, and then you have, the pandemic and so on, that and post-pandemic and now war-driven economic problems, inflation, that support, people can make a very simple kind of calculation and say, okay, we have democracy, it's not doing, we have bad outcomes, what's so great about democracy? I think a good counter to that is to kind of ratchet down a little what we say, what we are thinking about when we think about democracy. So democracy is a big word, and it starts to get loaded into some notion of the good society. But democracy, the way political scientists think about it, is kind of a set of institutions and a set of procedures, a way of doing things, at a minimum that the people get to choose who their governors are going to be. And, I don't think there are that many people around the world who want to give that up. Like, no, let's let the military decide, or let's let college professors decide, or, we might think that's a good idea.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So, if we take it down a few levels and say that's what it is, and we do think it also can produce good outcomes, like maybe a little more economic growth, maybe more stability of policy, maybe more concern with human rights, maybe more freedoms of speech and association compared to other kinds of government. But we're not making big promises of that kind. We're really kind of talking about it as a set of institutions and norms and expectations. Then it's not going to produce good results all the time. We're going to have, there's going to be hard times, and there are going to be many ways in which democracies don't work very well and need to be improved. So let's think about how to make them improve. But let's not fall into, my dad just lost his job, or I'm worried about getting a job when I graduate, and here we are in this democracy, and we've got this president who I was hoping was going to be better than the last guy, and he's not so great. So maybe democracy is not such a great thing. That's not the link I think that we should be making.
Mm-hmm. So what's the role between like what elites are doing and kind of what like we, the public, or the mass public can do? I mean, you look around our country for now, you see both Democrats and Republicans are talking about concerns with electoral security, but yet they react very, very differently, right? So you think in a lot of Democratic states, there's a lot of policies that try to expand the franchise, make it easier to vote. But in Republican-led states, you see just the opposite, kind of more procedures, kind of making sure the vote's kind of, secure. And so there seems to be a common recognition that democracy may be under threat, but yet we see the elites behaving very, very differently in terms of how they, react to that. So is there any possibility then, or is there any kind of room for compromise at the elite level, or is this something that has to kind of come from down below and the kind of the voters just saying, hey, we're done with this crazy partisanship on the elite level, we just want to get along with our lives and kind of watch sports without sports being like some crazy political statement?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure it's going to come from either of those. I think it may come from civic organizations, universities, the press, sort of civil society maybe in a more kind of organized sense rather than kind of public opinion in a kind of spontaneous sense. And when I say it, what do I mean? Well, we need to fight back against disinformation. So, election integrity, I think it's important to be able to push and push hard and not give up on persuading people and giving them good evidence that there's very little election fraud in our country. And that's just a fact. And making people think that there's a lot of election fraud, and furthermore that it's somehow linked with certain communities in our polity, that's insidious and it's wrong. And I don't see how we're going to get anywhere unless we keep pushing back against that. Now, on the other hand, I do think it's important for people who are, say, pushing for, let's say, January 6th, terrible event, awful attack. Those people are trying to, destroy our democracy. Well, what was the mindset of those people? They didn't think they were trying to destroy our democracy. Their belief system, maybe not good beliefs, maybe they weren't interrogating those beliefs very carefully, but their belief system was that the other side was killing democracy, that they had just experienced the stealing of an election, and they were there to defend our democracy. Now, that doesn't mean you just say, well, those are their beliefs, that's okay. Those beliefs were wrong, and it's important to work hard on pointing that out. But starting from, they're not there to destroy democracy. They think they're there to defend it. I think that's important. I think that's a way to start with some kind of common ground, or at least some opening, gambit that's not going to be so completely distant. So people will say, well, how can you say that to me? There's no way I want to kill American democracy. I believe in American democracy. I was there to defend it. You need to be able to start at that point with them. Now, with political leaders, it's a different story because there's a lot of cynicism out there. There are a lot of leaders of our parties who know very well exactly what happened, but they don't want to cross their leader, and they don't want to cross an electorate, a primary electorate that's very hopped up on these ideas. How you work on that, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure.
So I want to give the audience here a chance to ask questions if you have any. So, yeah. Yeah.
Surrounding so much of these like cases of democratic erosion is usually like one figure at the center of it, like one populist or whatever the case may be. To what extent do you think like that person is solely to blame, or is the democracy just fragile and it's only a matter of time until someone pops up?
Sure. Yeah. So the question is about these cases of democratic erosion that we see around the world often sort of center around a kind of populist leader, right? So to what extent is that kind of part of the story of what's going on?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. My answer would be that leader really is important, but that's a very entrepreneurial person and a kind of creative person who's figured out that this is a game I can play. But once he, and they're really, I don't think in my list here there are any she's, so I'll say he, once he figures that out, he's going to have imitators. And we see that in the US. I mean, we have plenty of people who want to come in and play the role of would-be autocrat. In fact, there's a lot of competition for that position right now. And so there are more structural causes to what is it that led to the point where that kind of entrepreneur could come in and play that role. So for example, in the US, we do have a process of kind of ideological polarization that started at the elite level, and Josh is going to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but going back to sort of the mid-90s, you start to see in Congress some additional, some real policy polarization of a kind that we didn't have. And that has to do with factors like the change in the geographic distribution of parties after the Civil Rights Act and so on. But once that happens, once that innovation has occurred, then I think it starts to be, it's not just one guy or one figure. It's sort of a kind of strategy that is public and people are aware of it and aware that it can work to their advantage.
What is your advice for our role to play in this? And maybe not so much the domestic sense, because I'm sure there's something every day that we can do in the sense of domestic politics, but more internationally for the democratic erosion that occurs in other countries.
So when you say we, do you mean sort of we as individuals, or what can the United States sort of in terms of?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of both, but I think mostly like individuals and, just simple people walking down the road.
Yeah. So, what can we do about, what can we as individuals do about democratic erosion?
So, just to step back and maybe respond to the question at more, I'll get to that part, but at the level of what can the U.S. do? So, there's a process in addition to these political entrepreneurs in a bunch of different places independently kind of figuring out that they can play this game. There also are processes of imitation internationally. And so, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil echoes Donald Trump's message that if I lose, it's because the elections were rigged. If I win, they were fair. He literally says the same thing. And I think that Orban had that same discourse. And certainly Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico had that same discourse even earlier. So they're copying each other. So modeling better strategies is a good thing. And they also are a kind of international, alliance is not the right word, cabal's probably a little too loaded a word, but there's an international kind of implicit alliance of would-be autocrats, a little bit sorted by ideology. So the Orbans don't hang out with the Maduros in Venezuela, but they do hang out with their Polish counterparts, and I don't know if Erdogan gets involved in this, but they meet with each other and they support each other and they give press conferences that can then play domestically. I remember when I was teaching the Democratic Erosion course that I think some of you are taking a version of here, a couple years ago, and Viktor Orban was coming to the White House. And I'm thinking, why is Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. What's the domestic, do we have so many Hungarian Americans who are going to care about that? We do have some. But it really was shoring up that leader who is very much admired and giving political strength by having him come to the White House. And then we got a kind of a big lesson in that when we figured out that that President Zelensky wanted to have that meeting and was denied that meeting. So from Ukraine. So they're an alliance and they're helping each other. They're a little bit in a fight now because of Putin and Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. That split them to some extent. Orban is sticking with Putin, and the Poles obviously are massively not supporting and are scared of him and are allowing refugees in. So it's important. So the Biden administration had this summit of democracy a couple months ago, and a lot of the press sort of said, what's that? That's kind of silly. I actually think a counter alliance of democratic countries is actually quite important. What can we do as individuals? I think just staying informed. I think reading about, maybe I think you do for your course, we do at Chicago, our course, picking a country and really sticking with it and learning about it and following what happens and following what is it that's working there to put the brakes on that. So, there's resistance to these things, and that can be social movements and it can be courts and so on. So staying informed and informing your network of friends and fellow students and the like, I think that's important.
I know the definition of democracy you gave was, I think, a set of institutions. I think my question, coming from a lot of theory classes where we learn about institutions and how they're self-sustaining, is how much is democratic erosion, how much can democratic erosion be attributed to, I guess, the collapse of institution, as opposed to, I guess, the intervention of a figure or a set of figures or a group of people in power in an institution or in the sustaining of an institution.
Do you want to repeat?
Okay, yeah. So if we define democracy as kind of a set of institutions, as you did, then should we think about democratic erosion as being something that's done as institutions kind of collapse or fall away, or sort of the individual coming in and kind of doing away with the democracy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I would say there's some of both. So I think that if you look at the what happened in the United States, or you look at what happened in Turkey, or any number of countries, there's some kind of process that where the institutions are kind of being eroded. You can think of it, there's a storm, and the materials get kind of corroded, and you get leaks in the roof, and then somebody comes along who will benefit from the whole thing falling apart and drives a bulldozer through it. So I really think that both things are going on, and there are structural reasons why we see this happening in a bunch of countries. We're not quite sure how that works, and sometimes it seems like it's really different trajectories in different countries. But I wouldn't understate the role of these kind of entrepreneurs we were talking about before, who see the opportunity and push things apart in a way that is much more visible. And I guess a good thing about that is we wake up and smell the coffee and say, wait a minute, what's wrong with our institutions? And what can we do to make these institutions look like they're more worth it to people? So yeah, I'd say both.
Yeah.
I was just thinking when we talked about democratic erosion, and started mentioning there's sort of a playbook of democratic erosion and things like steps that are commonly taken when politicians try to go down that route. So I think that the way we think about that is very much informed by what we see that is actually happening on the ground in countries where democratic erosion is taking place. So I was thinking if we can sort of do the other way around. Like, are there places that we can look at that have bounced back from democratic erosion so that we can take lessons from such places and think about ways that we can recover from that situation?
So if there's a sort of playbook of democratic erosion, can we look at the negative cases or the with I guess the
Positive.
positive
Yeah.
cases, the cases where democratic erosion, either sort of, I guess I would say, sort of would-be autocrats failed at, trying to erode democracy, or cases where we have sort of democracy return after erosion.
Yeah, so one place to look is courts. So sometimes courts have pushed back effectively. And why do they do that? Well, they have institutional reasons to not want to be rolled over by autocrats. And voters sometimes play an important role. Sometimes these folks are reelected and sometimes they're not. And sometimes when they're not, that sticks, even though there's resistance to the outcome of the election. Protests can be quite powerful. So countries like Poland and Hungary have had massive protests against particular policies, or sometimes eroding kind of acts, like attacks on universities, and that's provoked enormous kind of resistance and street protests. And that sometimes has led to changes, a kind of modification, a softening of the moves. Poland is a good example of that. In the United States, in some ways we had mechanisms to stop erosion that were successful to some degree. So the Trump administration was not particularly successful in using administrative law to deregulate, and deregulation can just simply be a policy move, and that's a different question. But to do things that appeared to violate democratic norms or liberal norms that seem to be embedded in our society, they had a terrible fail rate in administrative decisions, mostly because, especially for the first, I think, 3 years of the administration, they regularly were found not to have abided by the administrative, what's it called? The administrative, I've got it here. Something Act. The Administrative Something Act, which we'll remember in a minute. But they lost 80% of the time, something like 70% of the time. And it looked like they just weren't trying to win. Like they just slapped things together. I'm sorry, I'm looking for what to call it. So there was a competence problem, and also maybe a kind of theatrics problem. Like they cared more about looking like they were doing certain things than actually getting them done. Here we go. It's not telling me. So anyway, these are their wins and losses. They lost a lot. And then they started getting better. I think they started getting better lawyers working for them or something. But then you think about the challenges after the election, the court challenges after the 2020 election, and they lost all the time. They lost, I think that there was like one decision in the federal court that went against them, and tons of Republican-appointed judges decided against these claims of fraud. So the courts did a pretty good job. Now, the story's not over, and we have a Supreme Court that has, not entirely because of just Republican actions, but Democratic actions as well, the methods for appointing members of the Supreme Court have changed, and we have, a court that is in danger of losing a lot of its legitimacy. So that story's not over, but it looks like that worked pretty well. And I would add, I think that social movements were really powerful during the Trump. We had two of the largest social movements in American history. The second largest was the Women's March in January of 2017. And the largest in terms of the number of people who took part was Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives after the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And, it's not a straight line from those movements to some kind of at least pause on democratic erosion, or some promise of maybe that process isn't going to go to its full extent. But I think there are connections. So, and we certainly see that internationally. So.
I guess I also wonder how much crises play a role in, like how much is just sort of contingent, there's a crisis, and, right, so you have Argentina on your map, right, and there was some democratic erosion in the 90s, but then a huge economic crisis that kind of undid the powers that, you know, the sort of would-be autocrat and his sort of
his party. Yeah.
right? I mean, Bolsonaro was never particularly popular, but has certainly been weakened by the pandemic.
And the economic crisis after the economic
and
crisis,
the sort of economic fallout.
Yeah.
You know, to some extent, you know, 2020 was also decided in part because of the pandemic and
Right.
the economic hardships and things
Right.
like that. So, I mean, how much of this is being in the right or the wrong place at the right or the wrong time?
Well, I think that when it comes to elections, the usual rules are not suspended. You know, like, so public opinion is affected by some of the same things that we are always affected by, like the economy, stupid, and you know, and stuff like that. What's interesting about you know, we've talked a little bit about polarization. So why does polarization help a would-be autocrat? Well, basically, you can think of it as people are sort of trading off they might, all else being equal, they might prefer to have courts that are independent or a legislature that's able to do oversight or the like. But if they really care about the people they don't like winning elections, then they're going to trade off those, you know, they're going to be more willing to see democracy kind of shredded at the margins in order to, you know, keep the people coming to power who are going to turn us into another Venezuela, something like that. So those kinds of factors are going to matter, but you know, that's all going to be kind of silted in with, you know, with these other kinds of dynamics that I think are a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. There was another, yeah.
Are you aware of any sort of like movements that work to translate like academic knowledge into something that's more palatable for like common people? Because I feel like it might be challenging for like the average voter to grapple with a lot of the ideas we talk about here, and to kind of translate that into like a form of resistance against democratic erosion.
So how do we translate? I think the word was palatable, right? How do we, which is great. I like that. You know, how do we translate
things that won't make them gag? Right?
How do we translate what we study, what we all study here, and what we're talking about to the public in a way that is, palatable.
Yeah. Well, it's really important that we do that, and we should try as academics to write in accessible ways and to publish in more, you know, sort of mass accessible places. And there are a number of places where that's happening. So, for example, the Washington Post has a political science blog called the Monkey Cage, where a lot of our colleagues, you know, regularly, I think we've all done that, publish sort of the results of our research that matter to a broader public and in terms that are going to be more accessible to the public. And they're good editors there who help us turn it into more accessible stuff. I think we rely on journalists to do that a lot. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Don't Look Up. So one of the things that was sort of hysterically funny in a kind of sad way about that movie was the scientists who, you know, nobody wanted to listen to the bad news they had, and everyone had a stupid way of not listening, not paying attention. The scientists were also terrible at getting it out. They, you know, they had their moment and they're like, well, when we measured and nobody could follow what they were saying. So that's why you need science journalists, because they translate that stuff and they're really good at that. They're professionals. And I think social scientists also rely on professionals, journalists to do exactly that. So it's on us to make sure our stuff is getting out and that we're studying things that are going to be mattering to people and are going to make a difference in this moment that I think it really is a crisis. It's like crisis layered upon crisis. But there are pros out there who can really help with that.
I think on that point, like universities are also kind of stepping into that domain, right? So you have the Chicago Center for Democracy that Professor Stokes runs. Here at Vanderbilt, you know, with the Unity Project that this whole event's going to be live streamed down. Like they're kind of stepping into not a void, but they're trying to fill that, you know, space to help communicate and distill kind of what we do, you know, in our ivory tower to kind of make sure it's relevant and accessible to kind of people to try to move the needle and try to get that information out. So, you know, it takes work, but I think you see steps that are being progressively made to try to make that, you know, happen around campus and around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we should wrap it up and thank the Unity Project for hosting this.
Thank you.